Welcome back to Why We Buy It, watch fans. And today I got a quick question for you, and some of you agree with me and some of you will disagree, because me personally, I'm not a fan of these watches, but I know some of you are, and that's pilot watches and field watches. Are you a fan? Do you have them in your collection? Do you have more than one in your collection? Do they thrill you when a new one comes out? Because it really does almost nothing for me. Really. I find them to be the most boring watches, boring watch genre, really, that's available to you. I think dress watches, which many people consider boring, are generally a little more refined and a little more interesting than pilot's watches. Because all pilot's watches or all field watches are relatively the same. There are some minute differences, and some of you may argue that the chronographs are fantastic, but I don't consider those as part of the category. I see chronographs as their own thing. So you got to take that out of the equation. All you're looking at is the very legible pilot or field's watch that come in a number of case sizes, so sure, you can find something that'll fit your particular wrist. But does the actual watch itself excite you? Because it doesn't for me. Now, I do have one pilot's watch in my collection, and that's because it's a little bit different than everything else that's out there. And that's what attracted me to it. I love the legibility. As a general rule, I like a legible watch. You're not gonna find any like meteorite dials in my collection because the majority of them are difficult to read. So the legibility factor is a big thing for me, but just having the legibility in a very basic looking face and shape doesn't do it for me. I know a lot of you are a big fan of the Hamilton khaki field watches. I find them to be one of the most boring watch available. I mean, for what you're paying, I guess essentially you're just buying the Swiss movement and everything else is sort of placed on top as basically as can be. If that's your thing, so be it, but it's not mine. And it's one of the best selling sort of Swiss watches out there. Now, I think that's a combination of affordability and name recognition, not really the watch itself. But what watch should I choose to add to my collection that is of a pilot's watch genre? And that's the Alpina Pilot Heritage, the 1920 style limited edition. Let's get into it. So for pilot watch and field watch fans, there's a lot to like about the Alpina Pilot Heritage. Now, it's got a Flieger style face. Very familiar to most of you. It's got your large numerals as the 1 through 12 with the Alpina logo being a 12. Smaller numerals, you got an inside track that's got the 13 through 24 military time, and the outside track, which is your 60-second pips, right? With numbers at the indices. So extremely legible. And of course, that's what most of you are looking for when it comes to a pilot or field's watch. Now, what does separate it from some others maybe is that one, it's got decent lume, and the Alpina logo itself is lume to add a little bit of extra flair to it. But what really stands out to me first is this big crown, this oversized crown. This really grabs you when it's on your wrist. And it's also one of the things that catches the light, right? Because the majority of field watches or pilot watches are generally dull designs, okay? They are generally dull. So they almost disappear on your wrist outside of the legibility of the face, whereas this particular watch, it has some polished surfaces. It has a fair amount of brushing to allow the polish to stand out, but most importantly is it has this oversized crown that's polished that really picks up the light. And that attracted it to me because if you follow the channel and if you've seen some of my previous videos on my watch collection, you'll know that high polished surfaces that grab the light have always been one of the things that attracts me to a watch. So unlike the majority of pilots and fields watches, this one has that. So that really stands out. Another sort of interesting aspect of this particular watch is, first of all, like the pilot's watches of old, it's relatively big. This is a 44 millimeter case. Now, unlike a dive watch at 44 millimeters, it doesn't really appear as large on the wrist because it doesn't have that additional dive bezel, right? Everything sort of falls away from the face which gives you the illusion that it's more like a 42, and that's kind of how it feels on my wrist. And generally speaking, at first glance, you see this huge crown, you see how far it sits out, and you imagine, oh, that's gonna dig into my hand, but it never does. It really never does. So the way they've designed the lugs, the way they've designed the case shape and such is that it sits high enough off the base at the back of the case to allow it to clear your wrist and not dig in. So that's something that always kind of attracted me to it and ended up as an additional benefit once I started wearing it and seeing what it was like on the wrist. Another thing that I really enjoy about this particular watch, honestly, is the strap. Okay, Alpina has this sort of proprietary buckle system that they use where the first keeper is integrated with the Alpina buckle. So instead of having two keepers, one of which generally, most of you know, ends up sliding around, sliding off, having just the one sliding keeper generally keeps it in place and allows for a very secure fasten once you've put this through to lock it the way you want it, right? It's a subtle touch, but it's something that you would expect from a higher end brand, and Alpina is exactly that. Now, a lot of you probably haven't seen this watch or even heard of this watch in the past, and that's because the group that owns Alpina, which is part of the Citizen Group, okay? Citizen Group owns Alpina. Alpina has gone through a process of being their own independent brand to eventually selling to Frederic Constant. They bought them as a way to sort of offer a sporty line because that's what they're known for. And then having Frederic Constant and their entire group bought out by Citizen Group. So now they're part of that. And Citizen Group, they tend to advertise Citizen watches, but they don't do a fair amount of advertising for their Frederic Constant and Alpina labels. So these watches rely more on the authorized dealers and someone like myself, other enthusiasts, to let the community know about them. And they generally go unlooked. And honestly, that's something I can appreciate. I don't like walking into a room of, say, watch enthusiasts at maybe like a Red Bar meeting or something like that, and wearing the watch that 30 other guys are wearing. It's nice to come in wearing something original, and generally you achieve that by buying some of the lesser known brands or the ones that aren't as heavily marketed. And Alpina is one of those brands that isn't so heavily marketed. So that factors in, but the real linchpin, the real thing that made me kind of pull the trigger on this particular watch, that I just had to have it, is if you've, again, followed my channel, you'll know that I always look for something that's unique about each piece that I have, something very original, and this has that. This watch, being a 1920 style heritage model, goes back to the original sort of pocket watches that were converted into wristwatches. And one of the things those watches brought over at the time was the big crowns, of course, but also these, what they call officers' case backs. So the case has this hinge moment that allows you to open it up and actually see the movement, right? You've got the exhibition movement, you have the traditional Alpina rotor, right? That sort of off-cut rotor with the black. You've got the Swiss movement in here, of course, right? 38 hours of power reserve, high beat, 28,800 beats per minute, perlage in the interior case for a little additional decoration, but it's just this case back is fantastic. And the reason for the officer's case back is these watches sort of became a thing in World War I, right? And in order to protect the internals and such from the elements, they were deemed officers' watches because, of course, they weren't inexpensive. Generally, officers were the ones that wore them. And the converted pocket watches used to have a pop-open back and a pop-open front to protect the watch internals themselves. They got rid of the front because they want to have quick, easy look at the timing on the watch, and they left the back to help protect the watch from the elements, So this is how it ended up. An ancillary benefit to this particular style of watch and having this closed back is that it's my understanding that a number of different military groups used to use that closed back to keep messages or orders hidden within it, so that if an officer wearing a watch like this was killed in action, the next in command could get the orders in a coded form from a small piece of paper that was kept within the case back. So there's a lot of interesting history that goes along with this, but for me, it's just an interesting watch, right? It makes for something unique in a collection that most people don't have. And the design itself, although simple, has just enough flourishes to make it different. And that's why I personally purchased and added this Alpina Pilot Heritage to my collection. Let me know what's in your collection. Let me know if there's any watches you want to see me review or comment on in the comments. And definitely subscribe if you're a watch enthusiast and fan like myself. Till next time.